Swat Valley! Swat Valley!
Though we didn't have to travel far out of town to find our first taste of rather orchestrated out.
What are human rights? Well, human rights are the fundamental rights and freedoms that inherent to all human beings, regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, religion, and gender, or any other status. These rights are considered universal and inalienable and indivisible, meaning that they apply to every individual and cannot be taken away from one another. The concept of human rights encompasses a wide range of rights, including civil and political rights such as the right to life, liberty, freedom of expression, economic, social, and cultural rights such as the right to work, education, and healthcare, and collective rights such as the right to self-determination and a healthy environment. After all this progress in the creation of human rights, it is still largely violated. In this documentary, we will uncover the story of Afghanistan and how it plays a role in the violation of human rights, specifically through women's rights. In the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, amidst backdrop of the conflict and turmoil, there exists a struggle that echoes through the generations that fight for women's rights. But what does this struggle entail, and why is it of such paramount of importance? To bring it into more context, I will give you a little bit of historical background on how the Afghanistan has actually come to this ground and how it has started to violate women's rights. Well, Afghanistan's history is marked by a century of cultural richness and geopolitical significance, yet it has also been marred by political upheaval and external interference. In recent decades, the country has endured the Soviet occupation, civil war, and the oppressive rule of the militants, groups like the Taliban. Despite the sporadic progress, such as the establishment of democratic institutions and formal recognition of women's rights in the constitution, Afghan women have faced persistent discrimination and marginalization, while in some urban areas experienced relative freedoms, rural regions, and in particular remained entrenched in conservative traditions that limited women's autonomy and access to education and the employment opportunities. Coming over to the Taliban rule. Well, under the Taliban rule from 1996 all the way to 2001, Afghanistan experienced one of the darkest periods in history regarding women's rights. The Taliban's strict interpretation of the Islamic law imposed on the draconian restrictions on the women and girls, effectively relegating them to the second-class citizens. Women were banned from attending schools, working outside the home, and leaving their houses without a male escort. The regime enforced a rigid dress code, with women required to wear the burqa, and imposed severe punishments for violations, including public executions and stonings. This period witnessed systematic oppression and violence against the women, with many forced into marriages, subjected into domestic abuse, and denied access to healthcare. When women and girls have been systematically excluded from the public life, barred from attending school, working outside the home, or participating in political and social activities. Testimonies from Afghan women and activists paint a harrowing picture of fear and uncertainty about their future, as they grapple with the prospect of once again living under the Taliban rule and the erosion of their fundamental rights and freedoms. These are the things that are established in the current times and the current situations. However, let's delve into the more specific points on what this documentary is actually about. Why is it a human right violation? Obviously, the points that I mentioned above specify why it is a human right violation. But what rights in particular have been violated? The right to education, the right to work, the right to freedom, right to health, freedom of expression, and right to life. Obviously, there's many more, but these are the ones that we're going to narrow down, and more we're going to delve in. As we know, the underlying cause of human rights violations against women in Afghanistan stem from the combination of factors including patriarchal structures, religious fundamentalism, and the Taliban's strict interpretation of the Islamic law. These violations have been exacerbated by the Taliban's return to power in August 2001, leading to significant deterioration in women's rights. As you can see, I've been repeating this point again and again to show you how the Taliban rule has repetitively violated the human rights, or specifically the women's rights in Afghanistan.
حقوق خانم‌ها پایمال میشه.
چون کسی بودم همیشه اکتیو بودم، کار میکردم، فعالیت داشتم. حالا در چارچوب خانه
مثلا سرپوشش ما بیشتر از این که به فکر مثلا حکومت گپا باشن، زیادتر فوکسشان به سر حجاب گپای ما هستن.
همه بخش ها منظم است. یک زمینی کار بر ما مساحت نیست.
The Taliban is in the discussion of the creation of the world's most serious women's rights crisis. Different actors have played various roles in their hopes to counter the violation of women's rights in Afghanistan. Among the many human rights violations in present-day Afghanistan, women's rights have been under an especially large amount of scrutiny. The focus of the crisis in Afghanistan has dissipated over time as more international conflicts like the Russia-Ukraine war and others have taken over the news scene. But even though the conflict has been pushed aside, the people of Afghanistan are still living under very hard conditions. According to the Human Rights Watch, Afghanistan is also ranked last on the Women, Peace and Security Index. Efforts to counter these violations at a national level comes from protests by women within the country. However, they meet many consequences such as sexual harassment, violence, repression, and many other harsh repercussions. But these brave actions taken against the Taliban regime have been successful to an extent by putting pressure on the Taliban regime and also gaining international attention. As stated by Amnesty International, women along with their families, including little children, are arrested, kept in abusive environments, and tortured. The Taliban are trying their best to be formally recognized as Afghanistan's government, but the Afghan women who are fighting prove to be one of the biggest obstacles to the Taliban and their goal. The Taliban faces international condemnation by many international communities and non-governmental organizations. The Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the International Commission of Jurists are few of the many foreign organizations that take a stand against the violation of human rights by the Taliban and have adopted the position that the Taliban have committed crimes against humanity. Many nations like the United States, UK, and many European Union members advocate for the protection of women's rights through interventions such as the United Nations.
Dzisiaj z tego miejsca musimy powiedzieć jasno i wyraźnie, pokazać solidarność i powiedzieć wszystkim dziewczynkom i wszystkim kobietom z Afganistanu: nigdy nie będziecie szły same. Jesteśmy z wami, jesteśmy solidarni.
Moreover, non-governmental organizations such as the Human Rights Watch have conducted research, advocated, and campaigned to address human rights violations worldwide, including Afghanistan. They have documented abuses, raised awareness, and pressed for accountability for perpetrators of human rights violations, including those targeting women and girls. The impact of these international efforts has been limited. The Taliban's belief in the resistance to external pressure poses significant obstacles to meaningful dialogue and agreements regarding the violations of human rights, especially women's rights. Even after all of these attempts and effort put into countering the violation of human rights, the women and girls in Afghanistan continue to face significantly harsh challenges regularly. Gender-based violence, limited access to justice, patriarchal norms, and forced marriage are all examples of human rights violations that have become common under the Taliban rule. Achieving lasting progress in countering the violations of these rights requires consistent and sustained commitment. The Afghan women and girls have expressed strong and remarkable resilience which inspire hope for a positive change. While it may be challenging, the concentrated efforts of both national and international factors continue to make a difference little by little, if not by a lot.
This case study on violations of women's rights in Afghanistan under the current Taliban regime is deeply intertwined with various core concepts in global politics. Here's how it relates to the wider context and applies key concepts across different levels of analysis. At the global level, the case study highlights the universal struggle for human rights, particularly women's rights. The violation of these rights in Afghanistan by the Taliban raises questions about the effectiveness of global mechanisms such as the United Nations in protecting and promoting human rights globally. The case study also raises debates about the role of international intervention in promoting human rights and democracy in countries facing authoritarian regimes or conflict situations. It brings into focus concepts like humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and the limits of state sovereignty in the face of human rights abuses. At the local level, the case study highlights the crucial role of civil society organizations, activists, and grassroots movements in advocating for women's rights and challenging oppressive regimes. It demonstrates how local actors can influence national and global agendas on human rights. Understanding the local, cultural, and social context is essential for comprehending why certain human rights violations persist and how they can be addressed effectively. Cultural relativism, identity politics, and the clash of values are all very important and relevant concepts to keep in mind. From the perspective of the Taliban, their approach to governing Afghanistan is deeply rooted in their interpretation of Islamic law, known as Sharia. They view themselves as custodians of religious purity and defenders of traditional values, and they believe that their strict enforcement of Sharia is necessary to maintain social order and preserve the moral fabric of society. The Taliban justify their policies regarding women's rights within this religious framework. They argue that their actions are consistent with the teachings of Islam and they understand them as they understand them, and are aimed at upholding the sanctity of the family unit and protecting women from immorality and corruption. In the eyes of the Taliban, restriction on women's education, employment, and freedom of movement are not violations of human rights, but rather measures designed to safeguard women's dignity and honor. They believe that by confining women to the private sphere and enforcing strict dress codes such as the burqa, they are protecting women from the influence of Western decadence and ensuring their modesty and chastity. The Taliban's controversial religious justification for their rule is based on their interpretation of specific passages from the Quran and Hadith, which they believe mandate gender segregation and assign women subordinate roles within society. They argue that their policies are in line with Islamic tradition and are necessary to prevent moral decay and preserve the purity of Afghan culture and identity. While these justifications may resonate with some segments of Afghan society that adhere to conservative religious beliefs, they are highly controversial and widely condemned by the international community and human rights organizations. Critics argue that the Taliban's interpretation of Islam is selective and oppressive, and that their policies effectively deny women their fundamental human rights, including rights to education, work, freedom of expression, and participation in public life. Moreover, the Taliban's rule has been characterized by widespread human rights abuses, including violence against women, forced marriages, and restrictions on access to healthcare and legal recourse. These actions underscore the broader implications of the Taliban's controversial religious governance and highlight the urgent need for international intervention to protect the rights and dignity of Afghan women. Throughout this documentary, we've explored the harsh reality of women's rights violations in Afghanistan, specifically under the Taliban's rule. We've seen how women face restrictions on education, work, freedom, health, expression, and even their right to life. These violations aren't just about laws. They reflect deep-rooted beliefs and power structures that oppress women. To make a real change, we need strong laws protecting women, and maybe even more importantly, to make sure they're enforced. But it's not just about laws. Women also need support like education, healthcare, and job opportunities. We urge you, our viewers, to not just watch, but take action. You can support organizations helping Afghan women, speak up for policy changes, and raise awareness about their struggles. Remember, women's rights aren't just a local issue. They're a part of a global effort for fairness and dignity. Let's stand together to support Afghan women and strive for a more equal world. Thank you.